if they could be.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. So one of the folks that is a member at our church was asking, since the worship service starts at 11, if it would, if somebody would set it up so they could watch it at the church. So that's the mobile card, I guess. Good. Is Mary Eagle on? I can't see. Don't see her yet.
I don't see Mary either.
Not yet.
Okay. All right. So we'll. And apparently we can't rename ourselves. So I'm Jack and Betsy. Both. I couldn't find sometimes it's set up that way that there's not a place for me to rename. So that's okay. That's okay. Jack is teaching in another class this morning, so he's not going to be here. All right, so.
It's off, I guess.
We're picking up a couple of people. We'll give it another minute or so. And
That's right.
22 participants.
Right. I'll give Mary another minute or two, and if she's not on, I'll start us.
Okay, that sounds good. Is that David I see in the FPC mobile cart too? Yeah, there he is. Okay, he's waving. Great.
Great, great. All right. You know, I'm going to go ahead and just start us. I don't think there's a lot that Mary would add. So I'm going to go ahead and start. And if Mary jumps on, she can add anything that she wanted to add. I'm Betsy Harrington, and I am part of the commitment class at First Presbytery in Greensboro. And we are sponsoring a 4-week Sunday morning series in February. And as those of you who are on probably know by now, we are recording this because some people who are involved on Sunday mornings may want to watch this after it's over. We're really pleased as we get started with this. We felt like, and I presume anybody who's on here probably got the flyer with the list. But the series is starting this morning with looking at why the church is involved in advocacy at all. What's the point? What are we trying to accomplish here? And as Christians, is this something we're supposed to do? And where do we get the mandate and the call to do that? So this morning, Matt Logan is going to be our lead off presenter slash discussion leader as we go through this. It is just as an introduction to Matt. He is on staff at First Greensboro. He is the director of discipleship and young adults. He's been at the church for several years, and I've gotten to know Matt, and he's lots of fun to be with. And he is someone who is extremely smart, often makes me think and ponder, and I hope you will all enjoy him as much as I do. I asked him about introducing himself, and here's a couple of things he had said. Started, because I just love this. This is very, very Matt. He said, he'd like the group to know that I have little patience with sentimentality, and I'm allergic to piety, which has led to a life of adventure since moving to the South from Chicago. So that's a little bit about him, getting to know what the South is like. And but he then said, joking aside, his main interest in this conversation is the church's particular witness in American public life. His thesis, which was published in the Journal of Arts, Religion, and Culture, is titled American Exceptionalism as a Competing Religious Tradition to Christianity. He's currently working on a book about understanding our political history as an aspect of the present. It'll probably be called Rats in the Walls. Very mad. And reflections on several people that you or I may not have heard of. But he said his first job, he wanted to let us know that he's also been involved in politics. He said his first job as a campaign coordinator for young adults on Adam Kinzinger's first House campaign, which they won. And his second job was a campaign manager for Brian Woodworth's House campaign, which they lost to Jesse Jackson Jr. So he's got grounding in the political arena and also in the church arena. And we are delighted to have Matt this morning. And I will have to add, he is married to cute Annie and has the cutest little boys you ever saw, precious and precocious, darling little guys. So they make me smile every time I see them. So welcome, Matt. Thank you for kicking us off, and welcome everybody.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Betsy. Yeah, so I should say a couple of things before we get going here. So the first thing is that the lighting in this room will go off occasionally, and here's why. For those of you who are members at First Presbyterian Church, you know that that Newton Cowan just joined the staff full time, and Newton and John team up to play jokes on the entire staff. So they have put a canopy tent up in my office, and I don't know how they did it. And so it essentially stops from the light detecting motion. So it will go off occasionally. So I apologize about that. Thank you, John and Newton, for that. The second thing that I'd like to say is when I share my presentation, I will not be able to see you. I'll just be able to see the presentation. So if you have any pressing questions, please throw those in the chat. If those questions can wait until the end of the discussion, we will have time for question and answer here at the end for about 10 minutes. We hope, like, there's a lot to get through today, so we hope we can have some robust discussion here at the end. But again, if you have something, a point of clarity, or you really need to get something in, go ahead and throw it in the chat, and Yolanda will unmute and let me know what those questions are. Okay. So without further ado, let's get going here. So you might have noticed that the PCSA has published this document, Holy Discontent. So that if Yolanda, if you could put that link in the chat, that would be great. Some of you have probably seen that. I will be dealing with that a little bit, that specific document. So what that is there's a passage from Isaiah, which I'm going to share in a second. And then there are, there is a theoretical apparatus for kind of interpreting the text right after that. But the majority of that document is about tactics, how to share things on social media, how to get involved, how to get a meeting with your legislature, how to call or email or get in touch with your elected representatives. So I'm not going to read that to you, and I'm not really going to be talking very much about that. Instead, I'm going to talk about the kind of infrastructure that girds that document, right? The ideas behind that, why Christians are compelled to maybe use some of those tactics in our world. I'm sure you all are familiar with lots of ways to get involved, and especially ways to call and contact your representatives. If you're not, or if you want to think more strategically about how to do that, go ahead and click on that link and see that document. There's some great information on that document about those things. However, I will be kind of doing the in-between the Isaiah verse, what that Isaiah verse is kind of getting at, and those specific tactics in that verse. So I'm going to start, this is going to have sort of 4 sections. So we're going to talk about the verse, and we're going to talk about the history of advocacy in the PCUSA, but not like dates and times, more like the kind of camps and how to get involved and why as Christians we think this is so important. And then we're going to go ahead and talk, and I'm just kind of scrolling through here so you can see. And then we're going to talk about some of the perennial challenges that I think for members of this group that I've talked to, many people have shared sort of some of these questions with me. And so we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about kind of a different way to think about those challenges. And then at the end, we're going to talk about, once we have sort of the resources and the tools to maybe think about this in a little bit of a different way, we can talk about how, Christianity and being a Christian as our primary identifiers isn't something where we're always asking the question of how to act in the world. If we believe this stuff, if we are who we say we are, the world and the things that are going on in the world compel us to act in the world. It's not like we're opting in. It's really a primary matter of faith, whether we're acting in the world or not acting in the world. It's not like we're sort of ordering off of a menu or something, right? We could not act any other way in certain circumstances. So without further ado, let's get started. And I am going to go ahead and read this verse that is in that document, that link that is shared. And so it's in 3rd Isaiah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit at the end here and why that's kind of important. Isaiah in your Bibles, it's it's one book of the Bible, right? But it's really more like 3 books. And in this passage comes from the 3rd section of the book of Isaiah. Okay, listen for the word of God. This is from the NRSV, Isaiah 58, 6-9. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and God will say, here I am. So that is, while we're talking about this, keep that registered, right? That is sort of the echo that will go throughout this entire, for all the weeks of this class. And it is sort of the basis for that holy discontent document. There's the lights in my office. So yeah, thanks, John and Newton. Okay, so just to think about how the PCUSA has thought about advocacy in the last 80 years, and I'm not going to talk about sort of dates and times. I'm going to talk about more the theological approach, and I've broken it down to sort of 2 camps, right? And so it's important that we don't think about the way we act in the world or our politics or any sort of advocating we do or direct action that we do as sort of something that we do because we think it's like good, right? Or it comes out of our own accord, right? And so to think about this as being produced by our spiritual lives and our theology, first we start with primary revelation, right? Why do we act in the first place? What gives us sort of the theological or the ethical apparatus to make judgments in the world? And as Christians, as Protestant Christians, we believe that we have direct access to the primary revelation of Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, and Christ is mediated to us through scripture, tradition, prayer, and the church, right? Pretty easy to get on board with that, pretty basic stuff there. Like, we don't act because we are, we have taken a moral class or we have thought about these things very deeply. We act because of what we believe about the person of Jesus and who Jesus was. And we learn about, the person of Jesus, and we learn about God through scripture, tradition, prayer, and the church. This is like incredibly important, especially when you're kind of in these, conversations or maybe even arguments with people like about, well, you're just saying that because like, you have a different opinion of me. And it's like, no, actually, like, I'm talking about this because what has been revealed to me through scripture about the person of Jesus. That's really important. So that's the primary revelation that we have. What affects that primary revelation is the world that we live in, right? The Sitz im Leben, it's a German phrase that just basically means the situation in life, the context. This is really important for biblical studies. What is going on in the world right now that would produce these kinds of people and cause them to say the things that they say? The reason this is so important is because we don't live in the ancient Near East. We don't live in the first century. And so sometimes the scripture is, we have to draw conclusions about the scripture based on the time that we live in and understand the time that the folks in the ancient Near East and during the first century lived in, and even, you know, the 5th and 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century BCE, which is what our passage comes out of today, probably about the 8th century BCE. The epoch that we live in, right? Like we live in the postmodern era. So that is going to affect the way we think about that revelation and the way others think about that revelation, right? We kind of are living right now in this sort of post-truth, post-fact existence, right? It makes things very frustrating. But when we think about that revelation, it's important to balance what we know about what has been revealed with what we see and experience in the world. And so we also have experience, reason, and evidence. Some of those things are you know, I guess less important now, but it's important that all people who make judgments are making assumptions about these things, the things that they've gone through, what they think is reasonable, and the evidence, whether that be reliable or unreliable. That's how we're making decisions, but it's based on that primary revelation, okay? And then this has traditionally led theologians and ethicists in the PCUSA to be in two camps. And there is a predominant camp, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. I fit in one of these camps, but I've been fighting against the other camp in a good way because we're kind of all on the same team here for a while. So I think I can be pretty charitable to that side too. And I bet most of the folks in this group will fit in that camp. I'm very, very familiar with it because that camp has been kicking my camp's ass for about 80 years now here. So I will talk about those two different camps here in a second, but they're Christian realism and Neoorthodoxy. There are sort of these peripheral groups too on each side. One group is called like divine command theorists, and the other group sort of gets associated with fundamentalism. These are less active in our tradition. However, let me just say a quick word about divine command theorist is very, very simple. It's can sometimes be used as to get you out of particular legal charges. So I don't think it deserved a lot of attention, right? God spoke to me personally and told me to act in the world this way. It's like, okay. The other one is fundamentalism. And if you're a fundamentalist, you should be a radical. And if you're not a radical and you're a fundamentalist, then you're probably just using your fundamentalism to use the Bible to underwrite a partisan political position. That happens more often on the right, but it does happen on the left as well. Okay, so the Christian realism camp is the majority view, right? And this is the theory that is rooted in neoliberal Christianity and modernity. And this thinks more pragmatically about the world, okay? And these folks tend to be problem solvers, and they think, you know, look, there are no purity tests. The world is a complicated place. There are people that have different goals in mind, people that are, you know, the world isn't perfect. It's messy. So what you have to do is you have to get in the trenches, right? You have to use your faith in the things that you've learned through your faith to make a difference in the world. But there are no, this is not purity politics. Okay. And sometimes the Christian realists will look at the Neoorthodox and say like, hey, look, like this isn't perfect. You're going to have to make concessions. Like you're not going to be able to live in a way that precludes you from getting your hands dirty and working in the system. And so the Christian realists think that because the world exists the way that it does, and we are Christians in that world, we have to engage with it where it is, right? So we have to be involved and invested in these institutions in order to change these institutions, okay? The Neoorthodoxy is the minority view. This is rooted in post-liberal Christianity, post-modernity, and the confessing church, right? Like the kind of Yale theological movement, Karl Barth is very, very involved here. And this trends toward maybe idealism, right? And so the Christian realists think sometimes these folks are pretty naive and idealistic because they think, we don't want to get involved in these sort of flawed institutions, because we think that might make us flawed too. And so both, you can see the virtues of both camps here, but it is true that Christian realism has won the day. But the Neo-Orthodox think that, they living faithfully in the world, they recognize the evil in the world, but instead of kind of joining those institutions, they try to create a counter community that calls into question the institutions. And the really important thing about Neo-Orthodoxy is they tend to be fideists, which just means that they think that knowledge comes directly from revelation, so that what the Bible says about the world is more true than even what is appearing to you like in your daily life. One way to maybe think about this that is outside of the PCUSA tradition, but is still inside that tradition of advocacy. And this is not a great analogy, but it maybe will help kind of think through these two camps in the way to be an advocate in the world. So the Christian realist position could kind of be in this analogy associated with like the work of Dr. King. And the Neo-Orthodox position, Neo-Orthodox and folks who follow Malcolm X would not like me comparing those two, but James Cone wrote this really important book called Martin and Malcolm, and he talks about how both groups work together for social change. So the Christian realist, and this is an analogy, okay? The Christian realist would be sort of that king. You got to work within the system. You got to talk to your legislators. And then the Neo-Orthodoxy would be kind of that Malcolm X, like, no, let's create counter institutions to call into question those institutions that exist currently. So I hope I was charitable to both camps there. If you have any more questions, feel free to email me or something. We're not going to get too wrapped into that. But the good news is, right, just like Cone says in Martin and Malcolm, that members of both camps are compelled to act. This is not something that they, as a Christian, think, well, maybe I'll try this or I can opt into this. This reaches out to you as a matter of faith, right? Like if you say you believe this, you must act in the world. And these groups both kind of work together and can work together sort of as allies in this work. Okay, so this is my advocacy flow chart, and this will talk about how both of those camps think about things. And if you see on the right hand side, or maybe it's your left hand side, the top box is sort of more associated with the Christian realist position, and the bottom is more associated with the Neo-Orthodoxy. But they both shade each other. They both, both groups kind of use the tactics of the other things. And why I wanted to talk about this, because I think for anybody that would be critical of the document that we shared in Holy Discontent, I want to be clear that document is giving you information about tactics, and there are lots of tactics that you can use, okay? But it isn't, those tactics are abstractions, right? It's sort of second order or second level thinking. And so what I mean by that is the revelation of Jesus Christ. As Christians, we believe in the revelation of Jesus Christ, okay? We take that revelation and we put it through our own ideological lenses. And traditionally in the PCUSA, those have been through two lenses. That Christian realist lens, it's kind of like your Reinhold Niebuhr, and your Neo-Orthodox lens. That's kind of gets associated more with Dr. Stanley Hauerwas and figures like that. Okay, and then both of these groups believe that you should use tactics to act in the world, right? And so these tactics are not the things in and of themselves, but they're being inspired by that revelation, okay? So you have the revelation, you have your ideological lens, and then that leads you to act in the world in these ways. So if you're a Christian realist, you're more likely to kind of work through, charities, not-for-profits. You think voting is very, very incredibly important. You want to vote. And of course, it does shade towards things like contacting your legislature, which the Holy Discontent gets at specifically. Both groups believe in direct action. The Neo-Orthodox, thinking changing behavior, sort of changing how you act in the world. I mean, the Christian realists, of course, believe that as well. But I'm just kind of giving you an indication. And hopefully with this scale, you can get a good sense of where the rubber meets the road for both of these groups. But I would say that there's at least members of both camps that would do, that would believe in the virtues of all of these things. Maybe the Christian realists would think that, removal from society, and that's pretty strong. What I mean by removal from society is kind of like that countercultural insurgency, that you create something else over here. I'm not sure like the Mennonites would say they are Neoorthodox, but that would be an example of kind of what I'm getting at with that, is that, no, this is so corrupt, we're going to go over here and start our own thing and try to attract people towards it. And as a matter of advocating for others, I think it's fair to say that is at least, a position of advocacy, even though it's not direct advocacy. So reasonable people disagree about that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about our context specifically. At least at First Pres, I've had these conversations a lot, and some of these things are very, very obvious to people. Some of them are less obvious, but I'm going to challenge you today to think about your actions as flowing from your identity in your baptism. Okay, so before we get there, though, I'm going to talk about the perennial questions. These might be familiar to at least our First Pres folks, because it comes up a lot, right? How do I connect my faith with my tactics? Okay, how is it true that because I'm a Christian, I'm forced to advocate for marginalized people less fortunate than I am, or my neighbors, my allies? Is that true that I have to do that, right? Is there actually a connection there? This is just very simple, right? What does my faith have to do with my life? Some people, I think, find these things very separate, like, well, I have this job and I act in the world over here, and then I go to church on Sundays and I believe these things. And if I had to sit down and think about how, one thing interacted with the other, I could probably come up with some times in which they do, but it might not be coherent. It might not be always true that this stuff that you do over here flows out of this stuff that you do over here, at least in an integral way. It might accidentally interact, but it might not integrate in a very sort of true way. And this is the way I like to put it. Am I just sneaking Jesus in through the back door? I found, this is not, if you read that Holy Discontent document, this is not meant to be a partisan thing. So I'm just talking about my experience. I picked on those on the right a little bit earlier, so now I'll pick on these on the left. I found that politically in America on the left, this happens frequently, right? I have these things that I believe, right, about the world, about justice. And then I just believe these things. And of course, those have been inspired by my faith in these things. But I believe these, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the Bible, right, and go through my tradition, and I'm going to take examples of when Jesus would have underwritten these things, and just being playful here, like I kind of sneak Jesus into the back door and say, see, look, this is what Jesus would do. So these are our perennial challenges to think about how our actions in the world and our advocacy in the world is a necessary condition or an effect of our faith. Our witness and our confession, right, produces in us like this real compulsion to act in the world when we see injustice. And how do we think about those things as more coherent and less of a, let's try to make a connection here, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. So when you use analogies, or illustrations, the reason you can use those illustrations is because the two things that you're comparing are in some way dissimilar. So I was thinking about this a lot this week. Don't think too hard about this analogy or illustration because it breaks down at a certain level. But I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me 3 weeks ago. And I hope it gives you kind of a real life example of how an invitation to think about these things, okay? So 3 weeks ago, church went online, right? We met virtually. I came in, I recorded my FBC 101 class, our new member class. We had, Yolanda was running around crazy trying to edit these things for these Sunday school classes. It was wild, right? Because we had that snow and that ice storm. I mentioned before that I'm not from, people from Chicago would not like me to say that I'm from Chicago, but that makes it easier for you. I'm from the Chicago area, the neighboring sort of region, kind of where the suburbs end and the cornfields begin. But I have experience driving in the snow and the ice. And so when the church office was closed Monday, the roads were, you couldn't really drive on the roads, but Tuesday you could. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll take this opportunity, because the church is closed, to meet with a couple of my pastor friends in Durham. Right. So I have this little 4-cylinder hatchback car. Me and my wife call it the go-kart. Okay. And driving in the snow in that thing is not ideal, but the roads were pretty clear. It was a little icy, but I did not account for ice chunks falling from other cars. Okay. So I call this illustration Subaru on Subaru violence. I was driving from Greensboro to Durham, and I'm on 85, and I see on 85 these chunks of ice, right, start falling off of these semi trailers or these cars. But they're small. They're pretty small. The semis can't control it. The cars, you can wipe off the roof of your car. And I'm trying to really keep my distance. All right. So I'm inviting you to imagine that windshield. Okay. How you look in the world. That is your gaze. Okay. That's how you see things. And there are a lot of things that influence your gaze, but hopefully your faith is the primary factor in the way you see the world. Okay. So if we think about that windshield in that car as our faith, as our Christianity, okay. And everybody else is they have their own gaze. They have the way they see the world. They're looking out the front windshield. And the great thing about this analogy is, in a car, you have blind spots. So there are things that you don't see. Okay. But if you have a gaze, if you have a way to view the world, and you are interacting in the world in a way, you're all right in this world in which you're being affected by the elements, the happenings, the nuances, the natural environment. All the stuff that goes on in the world is affecting the way you see things. Okay. Now, I'm driving, and there's a Subaru SUV 2 lanes over. I'm in the second to the right lane, and this guy's in the fast lane on the far left. And there's also a Subaru SUV in front of me. All right. So the elements, right, are making it so the snow and the ice are starting to melt slowly. And this car is driving, and I see like some movement on, you see where this is going, the roof of this Subaru SUV. And this giant chunk of ice lets loose from this SUV, and it spins a couple of times, and it gets caught in the wind, and it does not hit me, but it goes over to the like 2 lanes over, and hits the other Subaru. And it looked like a spider web had developed on this car's windshield. Totally, it didn't penetrate it, but it, it's very hard to see. It totally affected the way that this person saw the world. Okay. Quite literally in that instance. So as Christians, I think sometimes this is the payoff here, right? This analogy. Don't think about it too much. I think sometimes as Christians, we think about our faith as giving us sort of tools to address the world. But I'm challenging you today to think about your faith as the primary way you see the world, and the world, the things that happen around you, the elements, will affect the way that you see that. Okay. And if you see the world the way that Christ sees the world, and it's blurry because the world has shattered your windshield, like, you have to act in those situations. Like, it's not something that you're using sort of the tools that you have at your disposal that, you've heard from literature, or you read from your biblical studies to kind of address these problems. It's that, like, when your windshield gets broken, literally, like, when the way you see the world as like a redemptive place of peace and love and God's justice is shattered, like, what are you going to do? Right. It compels you to do something, because even if that shattered glass affects some people more than others, I was so fortunate, right? I was privileged to not have that happen to me. Okay. So the way I saw the world wasn't sort of crumbling, right? It wasn't shattered, if you will. except that on my way back, a chunk of ice fell off of a bridge and cracked my windshield too. Okay, so there's this Black critical theorist named Fred Moten who I really like, and he talks about how, look, we're all sort of in this together, and so even though our world might be, the injustices of our world might be killing others faster than us, it's just about duration, right? The injustices in the world are all producing a kind of world that make it uninhabitable for us to live in. And if we do not act to advocate for those who are being heavily affected by those injustices, it's going to come to our doorstep too, and it already has, right? Think about something like climate change, right? However, it's not to say that that is the thing that compels us to act. What compels us to act is that, you know, we can do, how can we be in the world in any other way than to act when we expect the world to wrought this justice and this love, right, and this trust, and instead it produces this injustice, right, and this hatred and this viciousness. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Again, don't think too much about that analogy because eventually it breaks down. But I would just challenge you to think your Christianity is your primary vehicle for how you interact in the world. Because you can choose, like, to not take your car out. You can choose to sort of, yeah, I'm not going to get involved here. But then then the car betrays what it means to have a car, right? A car's job is to drive. Your role as a Christian is to get out in the world and to affect things in the world. Okay. All right. So we're gonna take this and think about it theologically. How do we understand Christ's actions in the gospel? If Christ is supposed to be the primary actor that inspires us to act, what is the example that we have? Okay. Instead of thinking of the world as the primary, I think it's more beneficial. I think it's true to think of, it is true that Christ is the primary, right? And so I asked Eddie Ellis, my Greek New Testament professor once at an undergraduate, you know, these questions, right? Was Jesus a contrarian? Was Jesus anti-establishment? And was Jesus a radical? And he said, like, you know, sort of, right? Not as a matter of like some position. It wasn't like if Jesus had entered the world and the world was like the kingdom of heaven, Jesus would have fit right in. Jesus would not have seemed like a contrarian, right? But so Jesus isn't motivated politically. It's the things that are happening around us that motivate us to act politically. It's not like we enter the world thinking, I'm going to be political. It's that we can do no other thing when we have these tactics at our disposal, and there's no other way to act in the world because of how we see things, of what we believe, right? So Jesus acts in the world in the way that God will act in the world if God enters history, which is who God is in Jesus Christ. So instead of looking at Jesus as kind of this reactionary figure going out putting out fires, Jesus is the primary, and the world is kind of acting around Jesus. And that action around Jesus is, you know, when Jesus acts, it has an effect because Jesus is so, you know, is so alien to the kind of kingdom of the world that those things are acting upon Jesus. So it's it's better to think of things in terms of acting political or acting an advocate as a Christian as like not being motivated by politics, but being motivated by your faith. And politics is a tactic in that exists in our world where we can use to produce, you know, the kingdom of heaven. Usher it in, as the document says. Help usher in the kingdom of heaven. Okay. Okay. How are we not like Jesus, right? There's some obvious reasons. We are not God. We are contingent, finite creatures. And importantly, our actions are abstracted from our will. Now, this is very, very important for this next part, okay? So this is Paul in Romans. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. So I think the reason Paul has been so attractive in the tradition is because you really see Paul's humanity in Paul's writing. He's very honest. He reveals, you know, what he's going through. Paul and David as well in the Old Testament. So in our modern vernacular, it makes sense to say something like, I believe in God, but that's just my opinion, right? So just think about that for a minute and how silly it is to say something like that. And so the challenge for us is to live a coherent life so that the way we act in the world is intrinsically tied to what we believe about the world. So we're going to theologize a little bit, and then we're going to get to the end here, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Okay. The good thing is that Christ gives us this freedom. Christ gives us the freedom to live this coherent life. And that freedom is the only thing that makes life make sense and makes death not make sense, right? And what I mean by that is, in our tradition, we call death a witness to the resurrection, because instead of thinking that death is a natural course of life, what Christ says is death is not natural to life, right? And that's the point of the resurrection, to free us from living where we're constantly trying not to die so we can live faithful lives. So Christ gives us that freedom. All right. This helps us realize the challenge, the perennial challenge that we have. God is a simple actor. I'm using these Thomistic terms. Simple doesn't mean kind of what you think it means. It just means that God's actions are not abstracted from God's will. God is impassible, which means that the desires of others and the feelings of others do not affect God, right? God is the primary actor, the primary mover. And God's eternal and uncreated nature makes it so that God's discernment and God's actions are not different things. We just heard from Paul in that passage of Romans. The reason we can produce a Christian ethics or a way to act in the world is because when God acts, it is a unity of will and action in one moment. So it isn't like Jesus is choosing between the lesser of two evils. God is not choosing the lesser of two evils. God's choice is a manifestation of God's will, which makes God God and us not God, right? Because that's not how we act. That's not who we are. We might think that this is good and act in another way. Paul calls this sin. I think it's an apt description of sin, right? We know what the good is, and yet we act in another way. So that creates our challenge. That is the perennial challenge. How do we make our lives coherent ethically so that the things that we do in the world flow from the things that we believe about Jesus? Okay. This is just a little, what I just said, I think, in different words. And what faithfulness is, it's the act of responding in the world that flows from the freedom that we all have as Christians. That reveals our faithfulness, right? It's not static. It is shown by how we act in the world. Okay. And it's really, really important. This is incredible challenge. I don't know if I know we have some other ministers here. I know especially for the young adults that I speak to, there is this dualism in the things that they think, in the way that the way that they act. Okay. And I think when we talk about advocacy and acting politically in the world, we have to do the challenge, the perennial challenge is to not connect those things, but realize that the way we act in the world reveals what we think about the world. Okay. There's not, oh, well, I think this way, but I act this way. That's an incoherent life, you know. Hopefully, to use a stronger word, that's an excuse. That's an excuse, right? You will show me what you believe about the world by the way that you act about the world, right? You will show me like how you think about your neighbor by the way you act towards your neighbor. You can't treat your neighbor crummy and then think, well, I love my neighbor, right? That makes humanity something other than it is. That creates distance between us as people and our neighbors as people. Like that makes them unhuman in some way, because the way your faith affects you is shown by the things that you do and the person that you are. It's not an abstraction from you, even though, that's possible. Paul again calls that sin. Okay. So the payoff for this is advocacy is not an option for Christians. It's not like, well, I am more of a prayer than an advocate. I believe in teaching. I don't really believe in advocacy. For our faith to have any coherence, we are compelled to advocate for God's justice in the world. You cannot believe the things that when you confess the creeds, I mean, if you believe that and you look out into the world and you don't act, I mean, your life is incoherent. It means that your faith is something other than something that has an effect in the world, and so this is not about choosing. Advocacy is not about choosing. It's being compelled to act because you believe things and the world happens around you and you can do no other thing. Okay. So again, you say you believe this. Do you really believe this? That's the question. All right. We're going to go back to the Isaiah verse really quick, and we're going to do this in 3 minutes. So we have 10 minutes for questions. Okay. I'm going to read this again. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and God will say, here I am. When I first saw the document, I had questions. And the reason that I had questions is because I thought what was going on is you had this Isaiah verse, and then you had all these tactics. Okay. And I didn't like that about the holy discontentment document at first. But the more that I thought about it, I asked the question, I kept asking myself the question, what is being assumed here? Okay. What is being assumed in this passage? In the questions that are being asked here are, they're challenges and they're rhetorical. It's asking the question over and over again. You say you believe this, but what are you going to do about it? Is not this the fast that I choose? Right? Like you choose, like you're opting into this, right? Like you're not opting into your salvation. Right? Christ has already done that work. What I mean is like you identify as a Christian. Is this not the fast that I choose? Like when you enter that community, you enter a discourse in a group that is tasked with loosing the bonds of injustice. Okay. It would be incoherent to think otherwise. This is not a feature of your faith. This is a primary motivator within your faith. It's not, something that you can, an extra cup holder or different, things that you can choose to decorate your house with. It is integral. It is attached to you. And that's what this assumes. That's what this passage assumes. And the important thing about this being in 3rd Isaiah is in 3rd Isaiah is when the Babylonian captivity is over and the Israelites are restored. And God talks about the restoration of the community, not through military conquest or through violence or through oppression or through coercion. He does it through justice. Like this is how the kingdom of heaven, the peaceable kingdom, is to be established in the world. And if, and it's asking you, the thing that is under this whole passage is, do you actually believe this? Do you actually think that this is true? Do you actually think that nonviolence and love and trust and telling the truth produces the kingdom of heaven? Because if you look in the world, it seems like the ends of the world, the things that are being produced in the world are like viciousness and distrust and greed. Like, do you actually believe that charity and virtue will usher this in? Because as a Christian, that's what you say you believe. Okay. And I began to have a lot more respect and admiration for the document, because I thought, oh, this is great. The PCUSA is on its game right now, right? It's saying like, we're assuming, right? This is an assumption. We're assuming that you're in the group here. And so if you say you believe this, how can you not act in the world? How can you do any other thing than act in the world? Okay. Okay. If you look at that that holy discontent document, there is a paragraph or two right under the passage and right before the kind of tactical piece that talks about the alternative reality. And both the Neoorthodox and the Christian realists think about how they act in the world based on this alternative reality that Christ is ushering in or has ushered in, depending on your theology. Okay. And so it's very important that we as Christians, we don't actively fight injustice because we think like by doing so it'll make the world a better place or less bad. We fight injustices because we can't imagine a world that is any different than the world that Christ has ushered in, that God has revealed through Christ. So this is primarily a matter of faith because it forces us to ask that scary existential question, right? Advocacy, being there for another, right, forces us to put ourselves in that spotlight. Do I actually believe this? I mean, I could sit here and pull passages from Scripture that are, that over and over again talk about witnessing to justice for the other, being an advocate for the marginalized, the neighbor, the least of these. But to do it in the world reveals that you do actually believe it, that it is a gesture towards the kingdom of heaven, because you can't imagine a world that isn't like this. Injustice is such an aberration to how the world actually is that as a Christian, you know how the world actually is, so you have to be engaged in this. It isn't an opt-in. It's not a decision that you get to make. If you want to claim the identity, you must be compelled to act this way, or else that identity is an abstraction from who you actually are. And that's where the rubber meets the road, folks, right? I sound a little bit like a Southern Baptist right now, okay? But that's where the rubber meets the road. Do I actually believe this? And what you actually believe is revealed in how you act in the world, okay? So thank you so much for this first week of advocacy. We have a few minutes here for questions. I haven't seen the chat, so I'm going to X out of here real quick, stop sharing my screen, and get back to the chat, and we can kind of open it up for some questions here. Gosh, I see all your faces for the first time. I didn't see all your discontent when I was talking. I guess that's probably a good thing. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. It looks like I don't see any questions in the chat here, but does anybody have, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Matt, one of the comments I would make, and it's more of a comment than a question right now, but as I hear people, I find very few people saying to me, well, don't go advocate on behalf of that. But as a congregation, don't tell me that I'm supposed to, or that my church is supposed to, or whatever, that it's more of seeing it more as a personal call to justice than to calling all of us. So I don't know if you have any comments about that, but all the way through there, I'm thinking, yeah, a lot of people would say, go for it, Betsy, but they don't say, sure, I want this to be a corporate thing.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm glad you brought that up, and I know you didn't mean it this way, but I'm going to take it in a way where if that's true, and it's not a misinterpretation, then that's an indictment on our church, then our leadership as a church, okay, and the church's leadership, okay, because the church's role is as the body that primarily witnesses to the word in the world. And so you are understood, you are identified as your primary identifier, you're identified within that community, right? So as an individual stepping outside of that community, You get your identity from entering that space. And because you are involved in the institution that has a very particular witness in the world, right? And so that to me is a reflection of that, again, that kind of modern idea that, well, I'll do this stuff on my own, you see, but I don't really think it's the institution's role to get involved. Like, the church is called the bride of Christ. And so, like, if we have any one flesh unity, then the church hopefully collectively is acting in and towards that witness. Because what happens when that sort of erodes is you have a lot of that postmodernity, my own personal Jesus stuff come in. And the other thing that having that powerful community does is it gives you a little push, okay, to be uncomfortable in situations where you're not sure. You know, you might go to Charleston, you know, you might do a die-in at the museum, and that might be out of your element. That might not be something you would have done before. You might speak up at your school board meeting. You might write your legislature. That is the courage the community can give you as part of an institution. And it speaks to, you know, a challenge to that kind of my own personal individual Jesus sort of stuff, right? The church has a mission in the world, okay? And to think about things like, well, I'm going to do my own thing is to, I think, betray that mission in some way. So I would say it's an indictment on the leadership of the church, even though I know that's not how you meant it, because we have to have a cohesive mission, or else what are we doing here? You know, what are we doing? Are there any other questions?
I don't know how to put this. I think what has concerned me over the last few years is when you have the voice of the church and they come out and make such a statement that I find really not what I believe. And luckily what I feel that First Pres would teach me. And it's hard for me to reconcile with these people that identify as Christians and stand really on the opposite side of the issue from how I view things.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you. I think it takes a lot of courage to just say that. And in the Holy Discontent document, there is a bit in there that mentions that it's important when we advocate to be issue advocates and not to be partisan advocates, right? And so there is risk involved, but I think the church gains a lot of credibility when it and Betsy knows this about me. I haven't made friends when I say stuff like this sometimes, but if you're going to be an advocate for children at the border during the Trump administration, you better be an advocate for children at the border during the Biden administration. Okay. If you're going to be an advocate for nonviolence, you better call the Obama administration to the carpet when they drone strike the hell out of the Middle East. You better, because as a church, if we don't stand for those principles of justice, then we just look like partisans. And there are going to be people who disagree with things like treating children at the border inhumanely. There are going to be people who call themselves Christians who disagree with that because they broke the law. They shouldn't be here anyway, right? And our job as a group, right, is to always gesture towards the person of Jesus and be willing to say, you're wrong about that. And we have done maybe not such a good job as the mainline church in the last year because we're worried about offending people. And what happens then is that welcomes. Hospitality is not creating the conditions for people to make it unhospitable for others. Hospitality has an arc, and it arcs towards justice. And like, there's going to be a point in time when somebody says, well, you know, I disagree with you. I don't think we should feed the hungry. where you're just going to have to say, you're wrong. I mean, I can't, we can go no further here, right? At a certain point, your faith is going to not allow you to be having the same conversation with somebody else, even if they identify as a Christian. And look, that's easier said than done, because we all have to go to Thanksgiving. All right. Are there any other questions?
Actually, at the witching hour, where I feel like those who want to go to church and worship in person, if they're at their homes, need to pull out. This is very provocative, very helpful, Matt. I so appreciate your launching this. Next week, we'll actually start getting into some issues, and the first one is going to be on education, and we have Ashton Clemens, who is with us this morning. Ashton is a member of First Pres Greensboro. She is also a very, very important part of the decision makers in North Carolina as a member of the state legislature. And she also is an educator by profession, by love, and she is going to be joined by Reverend Lee Curl-Dove, who is involved with the North Carolina Pastors for Children. And so we will look forward to the next few Sundays in our series. Thank you, Ashton, for being with us this morning. She will be wonderful next week. We hope all of you will join us. The same Zoom link will be in effect all the rest of the month, other 3. And if you have friends who couldn't be here this morning, we hope to have the recording of this available probably by tomorrow. And so if you would like that, we'll try to make sure you get that. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us, especially those who are from other parts of the community or other churches. We're so glad you could join us this morning. And thanks again, Matt. Wonderful kickoff for a provocative series, folks. Stay tuned. Thanks you.